Hello everybody and welcome to the Carlan Cymru revision sessions. The session this evening will focus on history AS level and will be presented by Karen Thomas from e-sgol Harry Tudur. This session will last around 45 minutes where Karen will run through relevant content. If you have any questions during the session, please use the question and answer section and we'll do our best to answer the questions. You'll see that there's a hyperlink in the Q&A section. If you're happy to leave your name and email address, we'd love to keep in touch with you so that we can send you information about future events. You can click on the link at any time during the session. Today's session will be recorded and the recording and any relevant resources will be uploaded to the e-sgol website under the Carlan Cymru tab. Thank you, Karen. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to tonight's History AS Unit 2 session. I'm Karen Thomas, and I'm going to be taking tonight's session, and I'll also be taking next week's session as well. So today's presentation, I'm going to start off by giving an overview of the whole AS course, and then today's session is going to focus directly on Unit 2, Question 1. Now that is the source question that you will have to do in your exam. So I'm going to begin by looking at some exam feedback from Question 1 from the Summer 2022 series. Obviously the exams went ahead last summer, so it is always good to look at what the examiners have to say about the candidates who sat last year's exam. So I'll begin with that, and then I will look at the WJC expectations. I will also look at the mark scheme to see what you have to do to get into Band 6 and Band 5, which are the highest two bands. I will look at the layout and the style of the question that comes under Question 1. I will look at the source checklist with you and also look at some useful sentence starters and just some general top tips for doing Question 1. So I'm hoping I'll be able to refresh current source skills that you have from maybe GCSE and also give you some new ideas as well on how to progress and bring them forward into your AS work. Okay, so to begin with, an overview of what we're going to be looking at. So in Year 12, you actually complete 2 units. You do Unit 1 and you do Unit 2. So Andrew did Unit 1 last week and the week before, which is the period study. And I will be doing the depth study, which is Unit 2. And I will be focusing on Question 1, the compulsory source question. And then next week's session, I will look at the interpretation question, which is also a compulsory question. So this exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes. Now, the presentation today is going to take around 40 minutes. And then, as Andrew said at the beginning, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function during the presentation. And then I'll go through as many as I can at the end of the session in the last 5 minutes. So we're quite clear then in how this exam is going to be set out for you. So you have Question 1, which is your compulsory source-based question. Question 2, which is your interpretation-based question. And it will all lead into that exam, 1 hour and 45 minutes, which you will do this summer. So there are 8 depth study topic areas in Unit 2. Now, Unit 2 is a depth study, which means it's got quite a narrow time frame. OK, so I'm going to run through the 8 depth studies that you could possibly be doing in your schools or colleges, and hopefully you'll be able to identify which one you actually do. So number 1 is the mid-Tudor crisis in Wales and England, 1529 to 1570. And the part 1, problems, threats and challenges, is what you would do in Year 12. So that's 1529 to 1553. So you can see that it takes roughly half of the overall topic title into that frame. So what happens is you will do the part 1, which is half of the sort of time frame in Year 12, and then you will do part 2 in Year 13 when you do Unit 4 and complete that depth study time frame. So you'll go all the way up to 1570 at that point. So you might be doing Depth Study 1, or you may be doing Depth Study 2, which is Royalty, Rebellion and Republic, or maybe Reform, Protest in Wales and England, 1783 to 1848. Or you might be doing Politics and Society in Wales and England, 1900 to 1939, or Religious Reformation in Europe, 1500 to 1564, or maybe France and Revolution, 1774 to 1815. Or you may be doing one of the last 2 topic areas, which is the crisis of the American Republic, 1840 to 1877, or Germany, democracy to dictatorship, 1918 to 1945. So as I said, Year 13, you would do the second part of that time frame, and that would constitute your Unit 4. Now, hopefully you've recognised which unit you do. The most popular there is probably Unit 8, but I will be including examples from other units, not just Unit 8, in my presentation today. And also the skills that I'll be obviously sharing with you can be applied to any depth study that you currently do with your school or college. Okay, so to begin with, what content do you need to know? Well, because this is a depth study and it's got quite a narrow time frame, then you have to look at the specification for your depth study and know everything in that specification. So you need to know it and understand it. Okay, now this link here will take you straight to your specification that you study. Well, it'll take you to the 8, and then obviously you can choose which one you do. Now, obviously this is going to be recorded today, but you can obviously pause it. The PowerPoint will also be put online, so you can go straight and follow the link straight through to those specifications on the WJEC site. And when you do go through, you'll find these, okay? These are the different depth studies. So if you are doing option 8, then this would be the depth study spec, that you would need to know. So as you can see there, you've got the challenges facing the Weimar, the extent of change in foreign and economic policy, the changing fortunes of the Nazi Party, the crisis of the Weimar Republic, and then the historical interpretations at the bottom. That is for your question 2. So everything above needs to be known inside and out for your question 1, and also the detail for question 2 as well. So there shouldn't be anything in these specifications that you don't know by the end of the course. If there is something on there that you don't know, then obviously there's a need to go back over and a bit more revision. Now this is the depth study for option 4. Okay, it looks very similar where you've got your concepts and perspectives and the key issues and content, but this is obviously for option 4. But you find which one is yours on the WJC site, and you might already have been given them by your teachers or your instructors. Okay, so let's have a look at the examiner feedback for question 1 from the 2022 summer exam series. So this is what the examiners said. It's really important that we look at what the examiners say, because we can guide students then the following year for the next set of exams. So the first thing they said was that depth study 8 was by far the most popular depth study, which I mentioned earlier. They also wanted to reiterate that grade boundaries change yearly. So of course, what makes an A star or an A or a B changes year by year. They also wanted to make it clear that there was a slightly new layout of paper in 2022, and that will stay the same for this coming summer, okay, which I will explain. Candidates need depth of knowledge as well as well-honed source skills and the ability to answer the set questions clearly and directly. Now, what that means is you need the depth of knowledge. That goes back to the specification and knowing everything that's on your spec, and well-honed source skills. Obviously, this question 1 is a source question, so you need to make sure you understand and know how to analyse sources properly, which I'll be showing you later. And also you need to have the ability to answer the set question as clearly as possible and as directly as possible. So you need to focus on the set question that's been asked to you, and that question is, what worth are the sources to an historian in a particular inquiry? Okay, so how valuable are those sources to the question that you're being asked? And you shouldn't forget that. That's very important. I'll mention that a bit later on as well. And number 6, candidates should try and address sources collectively rather than follow a formula. So what they mean by that is you need to make sure that you cover all of the tips that I'm going to be telling you in a checklist, but not in a formulaic approach. They don't want it static. They want it to flow. They want you to change the order of your source analysis, and I'll explain that a bit later as well. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the mark scheme and what they want from you. So for question 1, they are looking at AO2, which is to analyse and evaluate appropriate source material, primary and or contemporary from the time to the period within its historical context. And there's 3 areas that they focus on. So the value of the sources, analysis and evaluation of the sources in the historical context, and focus on this question set. Now, I'm only going to be looking at band 5 and band 6, as I said earlier, okay, the top bands. So if we look at the first section, which is value of the sources, for band 5, it says the learner considers the strengths and limitations of the sources. Okay, you're considering them. Whereas to go into band 6, the learner shows clear understanding of the strengths and limitations of the sources. So that clarity is something that will get you into band 6, being clear that you are looking at the strengths and you are commenting on them and the limitations of each source. With the middle band, the analysis and evaluation of the sources in their context. For band 5, there is some analysis and evaluation of the sources in the specific and wider historical context. So what they want you to do is to place that source into what's going on directly at the time, but also the bigger picture, the wider context of what is happening. For band 6, the sources are clearly analysed and evaluated in a specific and wider historical context. So that clarity is back in that to get into the top band 6. Okay, so you're analysing and evaluating them specifically to what's going on and in the wider context, but it's done very clearly. The last section, which is to focus on the question set, for band 5, the learner deploys the sources appropriately to support the judgment reached about the question set. And to get into band 6, the learner will make a sustained and developed attempt to utilise the sources to directly answer the question set. So to get into that band 6, you are doing a sustained, so it means you're maintaining all the way through your answer that focus on the question that is being set. You're going back to it, you're reiterating it, you're using the wording in it, and you are doing that all the way through, which is why you would get into that band 6. So it's really useful to look at a mark scheme because it tells us a lot of what the examiners are going to be looking for and where they're going to award marks. Now then, as I mentioned earlier, there's some changes, slight changes to the question that you are going to be asked. So I'm going to show you what those changes are and how the layout of the paper changes slightly as well. So for question 1, 2019 and previous to that, your question, the stem of the question would be, for question 1, with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying. 30 marks for this question, okay? From 2022 and for you in 2023, the question will now be using your understanding of the historical context. Assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying, 30 marks. So the only difference is that beginning bit with the reference to the sources and comes out, and you put the word using instead. Okay, so it's just that slight change to the stem of the question. And the reason why they've done that is because they don't want you to sort of reference the source and sort of constantly refer to it and quote from it. You don't need to do that all the way through. Okay, they want you to put it into context of what's going on, bring in your additional knowledge, okay, and look at the value of the sources to the question more, okay, which is why they've got rid of that beginning bit. So this is how the paper will now look. Okay, so this is the 2022 Depth Study 8 paper, so last year's Depth Study 8 paper, and you can see that you've got the question at the beginning and it starts with that stem using your understanding. Okay, so we know straight away it is 2022 or onwards. Then you have your source and you have the attribution, the information about who's written it and why it was written. That comes above the source. Okay, then you have your 3 sources which go across 2 pages. So that is how it is laid out. This is an example from the Depth Study 6, okay, which is France in Revolution. So again, exactly the same layout. Look, you've got your question, you've got your attributions, and then you've got your sources. You don't always have to have written sources. You may have pictures or maps, okay, as part of your source pack that they give you, and that's what's happened in this one here. You've got your picture source there. Now, if we compare that to 2019 and before, okay, we can see that there is a layout difference when we compare the 2 papers. So here you have got the sources in boxes, okay, and you've got your attribution, your information about the source directly underneath. And your question in the 2019 and before papers will come at the end. And we can see there it's got the old stem look with reference to the sources and we would change that to using your understanding. Okay, now just because the layout of the paper is a little bit different and that question, the beginning bit has changed, it doesn't mean we can't use past papers. Quite the opposite, please do. Okay, all you need to do is to slightly change that question. They can still be used for practice and they're excellent to do. This is an example from May 2019, and this is Depth Study 3. And you can see again, it's the same old layout with the question at the end and the boxes and the attributions underneath the sources. Okay, so I think we've made it quite clear. The 22 paper will be using your understanding of historical context, assess the value. And that's exactly the same, doesn't matter which depth study you do, that will be the wording for your paper this year. But we can still use past papers, okay, just by obviously changing that beginning bit with reference to the sources and take that out and put using instead, and it can still work. Now, the question 2 on your paper, which is the second compulsory question, is an interpretation question. Okay, it is worth 30 marks, same amount of marks as question 1, but I'm going to leave that and I'm going to look at that next week with you. Okay, so we are going to focus today just on question 1. So this is a checklist. If you do all of these things really, really well and stick to that mark scheme of what you have to do, then you could be getting into that band 5 and band 6 answer. Okay, so this checklist we will be running through, and I'll be showing you how to do these little sort of source analysis tips, okay, on different sources. But just remember, you're not going to use it as a checklist and follow it directly. You're going to use it and use it freely so it suits your writing and the way that you analyze the source. So just some information, all 3 sources they give you will be primary, or they'll be contemporary from the time that you're studying. Now, we recommend that you use around 15 minutes to evaluate the sources and then about 45 minutes to actually write up your response. Now, this is from the WJC, so we've got some official terminology here, and it says you will need to consider the strengths and limitations of the provided sources within the context of the specific key issue rather than the depth study as a whole. So how would we do this and what exactly does it mean? Well, basically what it means is you need to focus on the question it is asking you, okay? And you need to highlight, underline the question's key issues that you know that is what you're going to be focusing your answer on, okay? So this is the 2017 Depth Study 8, okay? So we've got the with reference, we've got the old style start, so we could change that to using your understanding. Okay, have a little look and see what would be the focus, the key issue here that you would need to focus on. Okay, we've changed the beginning bit to using. I've zoomed in a little bit. It is opposition, okay? That is the key issue. That is what they want you to focus on. That is the word that needs to appear again and again when you're writing up, okay? So you're showing the examiner that you are focusing in on what they want to know. It is also very important that we look at the time frame that they're asking you to look at as well, okay? So this is opposition to the Weimar between 1920 and 1932. So we should refer to that throughout our source analysis. Okay, so this is a different one. This is 2022. This is Depth Study 6. Okay, so what is the key issue here? Have a little look. Yeah, this development of political change in France. Okay, and then we've got our time frame between 1786 and 1791. Okay, so the stem of the question doesn't change. We are looking for the end of that question to see what we need to focus on and remember to refer to it in our answer. So we've done the first thing. We've identified the key issue. What I tell my students to do sometimes is to write that key issue above each source so that they can constantly, when they do their source write-up, refer back to it. Okay, it's up to you if you want to do that or not. Now, another official terminology alert. So you need to debate and offer judgment on the value of the sources to an historian studying a specific issue, with a focus on discussing the content, provenance and tone of the source, as well as the context in which it was produced. So how would we do that and what exactly does it mean? So if we pick up the keywords, okay, you need to give judgments, you need to look at the value of the sources, you need to look at the content, the provenance, where it comes from, the tone of the source, how it's written, as well as the context in which it was produced. So what is going on directly at that time and in the bigger picture as well. So top tip 2 is to highlight, underline the relevant information in the attribution of each source, because that helps you to put the source into context before you read it. So there's the word at the top, opposition. Look, that's the theme, that's the key issue that we're focusing in on. And I've purposely chosen a 2017 paper here to show you that they can still be used, even though the layout is slightly different. It doesn't matter. OK, I'll compare this to one that's 2022 towards the end of the presentation. So we would look at the little bit of information here underneath in this paper. So it's a pamphlet issued by the Social Democratic Party members of the Weimar government and circulated to the population of Berlin in response to the Kapp Putsch in March 1920. So I've just highlighted the important bits of information that I need to refer to and know about that source before I read it. Now it's up to you. You could go straight in and read the source now that you know the attribution where it comes from, or you could do all of the attributions. Personally, I do all the attributions first, but it's up to you. There's no better way of doing it at all. So source B is Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, in a speech at his trial for treason in Munich in February 1924. So again, I've highlighted the important bits of information that I might want to refer to there. And the last one is an extract from a letter written by German industrialists to President Hindenburg in November 1932. So I have looked at the provenance of the source, where it comes from, the background of it, and I started to think about the bigger picture, why that would have been written at that time. So the other thing we need to do is to read the actual source, OK, and look at the content and look at what the main point that source is making. Now, because this PowerPoint is being recorded, this presentation, tonight is being recorded, you can obviously go back into it when it has been uploaded and slow it down so that you can actually read the sources in more detail and see if you agree with me with what I've highlighted there. I'm just going to show you what I've highlighted, OK, because obviously we've got a lot to get through. So you can pause it when you go back into it. This is source B. This is what I've highlighted in source B as important bits of information that I might want to remember when I do my source analysis. And this is the source C and what I've picked out from that source as being quite important and things that I might want to refer back to. So I've looked at the content. Now, in doing the content, OK, because I've looked at the attribution as well, I've got a date, I know who's written it, I know who the audience is, who's going to receive this information, I know the form it takes, that it's a newspaper or a letter or a speech. I've started to look at the language because that is what I've just read in the content, and I'm also starting to think about additional information on the topic as well. Now, when you look at the language, you need to look at the tone of the source. How has it been written? So this pamphlet is quite a bigoted pamphlet. OK, it's a left-wing reaction to the right. So we would treat it with caution because of that. With regards to source B, this is the speech. Obviously, Hitler is doing it in front of, the trial. So he's got his judge and other important people there. So the tone is respectful, yet is quite forceful in what he has to say. He's putting his point of view across respectfully. And then source C, what we've got here, the tone, this is from the letter by leading German industrialists to Hindenburg. The tone is trying to be neutral. He's trying to take a neutral political stance. But then towards the end, when you get a chance to read it, it's actually trying to direct the president into appointing Hitler on the premise that he was the leader of the most popular party in the Reichstag. So it's neutral to a point, but we would treat it with caution because the industrialists obviously have a reason why they want Hitler to come into that position, because it would obviously be of benefit to them. So we have looked at the tone of the source. Now, when we look at the reliability, two sort of words that could be put into your source analysis are the words objective and subjective. So objective is a source which informs. It means it's balanced and it's factual rather than being biased and opinionated. Subjective refers to information that is based on personal opinions. So when you have a source, they might fall into one of these categories, and you can obviously use this word then to explain it. But when it comes to reliability, you have to think about, can we trust the source? Can we think about whether it is useful or not? We need, therefore, to know additional knowledge on the topic, and we need to keep coming back to how valuable that source is for that question, which is opposition, that key issue. So remember, we're looking at opposition, we're looking at the value of these sources. to that key issue. Okay, how valuable are they in showing opposition? So what I tell my students to do is to do a plus and minus. The plus, you look at the strengths and how valuable they are. And for the minuses, you would look for any weaknesses or any omissions, anything that's been left out, any biases or perhaps some limitations. So with this particular source, okay, this is the pamphlet. The strengths are that it is evidence of the right threat, that there is popular backing needed, and it sort of reflects the pessimistic mood of things. The weakness would be that it is obviously propaganda, it's negative propaganda coming from them. So we'd need to bear that in mind when we do the writing up of how reliable the source is. With source B, the strength of it, this is Hitler's speech, is that it's a speech showing disgruntled Germans in 1924 that, like source A, there is a need for popular backing, the putsch and the lessons that have been learned from it. And like source A, the seizing power by force is not going to work. Okay, in the bigger picture, the Ruhr crisis has just happened as well. So we need to take into account all of these things when we're writing about the strengths of the source. The weaknesses is that obviously, again, it is propaganda, it is a triumph, it's patriotic defence. So we would treat that with caution as well. And then the last source, which was the letter, the strengths are that, you know, there was in 1932 a nationalist movement sweeping through the country, and it reveals the disunity within the right parties. The weaknesses would be that, you know, he's calling for a rebirth, which would suit the industrialists, as we said earlier. It actually is failing to mention that at this point, the Nazi support is falling and there's divisions within the party. And that is because the German industrialists are not wanting to point that out, because it wouldn't be in their benefits to point that out. So again, we would mention that because it's bringing in that we know things that were happening in the content outside of the source at this time. So you need to comment on how valuable that source is to the question, okay, and make sure that is done. So what I've got here is the exam feedback for what you should put into each source. Again, there's a lot of information here, so I put it there and you can obviously pause the PowerPoint and have a good read of it. So source A, source B is here and source C, okay. So basically, you've made all your notes around your three sources, and now it's time to write up your notes. So I've got some tips on how to put an introduction together, some possible sentence starters for main and possible sentence starters for conclusion as well. Now, I can't reiterate this enough, but in your introduction, use the word valuable, okay? Use the value, use the key concept, that key issue that is asking you to concentrate on. You need to show the examiners that you are focusing in on what they're asking you to focus into. So possible introduction sentences, which you could develop to suit your own way of writing. So you might want to say somewhere in your introduction that the sources, whilst they all have their uses and are valuable to the issue of whatever the key issue is, they do vary due to omissions or biases, which could affect their overall value. Or you might want to say the sources are only small extracts, so they're not comprehensive to the topic of opposition that we just looked at, or whatever your key issue is singularly. However, each hold their own individual values, or even they have different opinions on. But you're just explaining that, you know, each of the sources have their value, but they also have their negatives as well. In your main body, you might want to be explaining that it's essential that for each source, at least once that you write, the source is of value to an historian studying whatever the key issue is. Okay, so it might be opposition, it might be the translation of the scriptures, it depends on what your personal question is. You might want to be putting things like source A is of value because it suggests it was written by, then this further adds to its value because. So keep using that word value, okay? And source B is relatively valuable. If you've got a source which is sort of in between, you could use the word relatively valuable to an historian studying, in this case opposition, because, and explain your point of view. If there are anything which are sort of been left out or any negatives, but however it fails to mention and you bring in what else you know about the topic area. Or you might want to use whilst valuable, source C does need to be treated with caution because. So even if you struggle to understand the source, a decent comment which gives a reason why the source is of value to an historian studying whatever it is will get you potentially 20 out of 30. All of the sources will have a value and give a mini judgment on each source as you go through. So remember to use all of your highlighting, all of your underlining, all of your notes as you're going through your write-up, okay? What we've got here is some possible sentences that you could put the how valuable word to, okay? So it is valuable when studying opposition because it's evidence of the fact that the threat posed by the right had potential to destroy the Republic. Or it is valuable when studying opposition because it's an example of the negative propaganda launched by the left wing in Germany. So you could use that and then add in the point that you are making, and that would get you marks because you are focusing on the value of the source and bringing in your justification, your judgment on it as well, which is really good. So I've got some examples for that for source B as well that you might want to have a little look through, and also for source C as well. Okay, so remember, it is valuable for studying whatever your key issue is and bring in the point that you're making. Okay. Right, so in addition to the sentence starters that I've given you, there are some here from the WJC as well, which are contextual sentence starters that you might want to have a look at and think about and use. So if you're thinking about what else is going on at the time, you could say source C is misleading given that, and you'd bring in what you know about the time when source A was written, by the time of source B, at this time, however. So that is putting it into context and showing the examiner that you know what is going on at the time. If you're looking at the value of the source, you could be saying source A and B are clear in their view that, or the provenance suggests that this would be source B develops this point, all of the sources. And if you're looking at limitations, you could be using sentence starters such as source B is wrong when it says that, or source A claims, but it was written before. None of the sources focus on anything other than, or sources A and C suggestion that. So linking of sources is really good as well when you're looking at the limitations and values, if there is a link between them. So we're at the conclusion. Okay, so when you get to the conclusion, you've analysed your three sources, you've taken it back to the key issue, you've shown the value of them. Okay, and in your conclusion, you should be putting together something like this that you might want to use as a starter to develop into your own conclusions. So something like, collectively, the sources are of value to a historian studying. Or in conclusion, the sources are very valuable to an historian studying. Or the three sources do provide use and are of value. They may have different opinions of, but when they're used together, they are of greater value. However, each have their respective omissions or biases. They are small extracts, they're not comprehensive to the topic singularly, but together they provide insight into opposition or whatever the key issue is, which when used together provides a balanced overview. So that is really good for saying basically on their own, they're not as good as when you put them together because you have a much better overview of that topic area when you use the three sources together. And remember to reiterate, the sources, whilst they all have their uses, they do vary in value due to omissions or biases, because that affects their overall value. But when they're used together, they are of more value of the theme of. Okay, so use some of these, develop them to suit your own writing. So when you do practice papers, you will very often have your teachers or lecturers annotating your work. And these are the sort of codes that they will use to annotate your work. And again, we can learn something from this because again, it shows us what they're looking for or maybe not looking for in their answers, or in your answers. So an S would mean that you are discussing the strengths of the sources. An L would discuss the limitations. At, you're using the attribution. An SE, you're giving source evaluation comments, maybe on the bias, the reliability or the validity of the source. CXT, you're discussing the context surrounding the sources, which again, you need to do. V, you're looking at the value of the sources to the historian. OM, you're giving perhaps omissions of what's been missed out. UCN is you're giving a narrative of events. So you don't want to give too much of that because you want to stick to the question and look at the value of that source. So hopefully you have done all of these things in the stars when you have done a good evaluation, a source analysis. So you've given your judgments, possibly all the way through. You've put it into context and brought in what is happening at the time. You've discussed the limits of the source and you've discussed their usefulness, their utility. Just some general do's and don'ts here. So don't assess source from a formula, okay? Don't be static and follow that checklist sentence by sentence. They all need to be covered, yes, but do it in a flowing way. You have to comment on more than just the content and the attribution of the sources to get into those top levels. Don't copy long sections of the sources out. The examiners don't need to see that. They already have a copy. No need for long historical introductions or any irrelevant background materials. And you also don't need to rank the sources. So these are all the things that when you're evaluating the sources, you should be doing. So have a little quick look through that. There shouldn't be anything there now that you don't understand, because we've been through all of those things. And you know that all of your notes and your highlighting and underlining around the source would cover all of those things. So let's have a quick look at this. This is from Depth Study 8. So this is the question 1. We can see now that obviously the questions at the beginning and your attribution goes alongside each source, not at the end. So that's slightly layout in paper and the different stem of the question. So remember what we have to do. OK, we've got the 3 sources here. So this is our checklist, okay? We need to remember to do these things with each source. So we start off by identifying the key issues. This particular one, this is from Depth Study 8 last year, 2022. So it's the political developments in the Weimar Republic between 1920 and 1932 that they want you to focus on. Then I would go in to look at the attributions. OK, so this first one is by Kapp, a right-wing political activist. He's in a public proclamation to the German people. So he's talking to them aloud in 1920. OK. The second one, source B, I've written, as you can see, what I'm focusing on to keep my answer tight to that question is the political developments in the Weimar, 1920 to 32. This is an article from a left-wing British periodical, The New Statesman, about the electoral campaign during the recent Reichstag election in September 1930. So we've jumped on a little bit in the time frame here. And this last one is from Dr. Wilhelm Kultz, who is a former Reich Minister of the Interior, in a memorandum to the German Democratic Party in 1932. So I know now where each of my source comes from, who has written it or who has said it, on the time frame, and then I would read each source, picking out the important bits that I might want to develop into my answer. I would then, after doing that, look at the bigger picture of what's going on and look at the tone of the source, look at their strengths, their values, and look at their weaknesses and omissions. OK, so for example, with this one, the tone is quite right wing, so we would treat it with caution. There's political justification here for the overthrow of the Weimar. Put it into context of what's going on immediately and at that time. So there's a lot of right-wing discontent at this time. OK, the rejection of democracy. It's the early years of the Weimar. There's lots of turmoil and instability. And there's justification here of why that Kapp putsch has happened. The strengths is evidence of the unhappiness of the right, and also the weaknesses would be that we'd be careful with it, we treat it a little bit with caution because the journalistic panicking in the wording of it, OK, because obviously it's been said to people, the audience would be people who were listening to it, and that panic is coming across in what they're saying to justify what they've done. With regards to source B, OK, we've got here the tone. This is the article. It's quite dramatic. It's been written in when you get a chance to pause the PowerPoint and you read it. You would agree, no doubt, that it's quite a dramatic tone that's coming across here. The violence, the frenziness of it all. And obviously, you put it into context. You know, at this time, you got the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, the Grand Coalitions, and the 1930 elections. So mention all these things that were going on at this time would help the examiner to know that you knew your stuff and you knew what was happening at this point. The strengths of the source, it shows the transfer from parliamentary government to the presidential power, and it shows the Nazi violence underpinning their electoral successes, going from 12 seats to 107. And the weaknesses, obviously, it may have sensationalised the facts for this British periodical, because it's going back to a different country, explaining what's happened, and it might have that sort of sensationalized sort of element to it. And source C, this was the memorandum to the German Democratic Party. So the tone here is quite pessimistic, but it's also quite emotional as well. So we're looking at the context, what's going on at the time. It's April 1932, elections which were banned the SA and the SS. And the strengths of this source shows the political extremism that's threatening the stability of the Weimar. It's an honest reflection of the political realities in the July 1932. We would treat it with caution though, because the weakness of it is that, you know, as supported democratic Republican Germany, so we would be careful with it. Okay, it's an emotional, pessimistic overview of where the situation is with regards to the political developments in 1932. So what I have also included here is the examiner's overview of what they think should go into the answer. So again, have a good look through and see if you would have picked out any of these things in your source analysis. So next steps for students, okay, for Unit 2 question 1. So the first thing I would suggest you do is make sure you understand the specification for your particular depth study and you know every key issue that's mentioned in it. Obviously, it's February, so there's still a couple of months left to go until your exams. So you might not be completely up to date and finished every single thing in that spec, but you should be able to tell where you're at in it, okay, and how far more you've got left to do. If you haven't already been given one by your teacher or lecturer, then follow the link there and download your specification from the WJC site, because that is your guide to what you need to know. Practice the techniques, the ones I've given today, to evaluate depth study sources. You could use past paper questions or examples that may be given to you from your teachers. The link here will take you straight to the WJC past papers. The questions are there and the mark schemes. And remember, just because 2019 and previous had that little change in the layout and the style of the questions, they can still be used, as I have shown you this evening. And time yourself writing up your notes, okay, using your highlighting, your underlining, use some of the sentence starters that I've given to you today to focus your answer on the question. Make sure that key attribution is being mentioned all the way through and that you're justifying, you're giving judgment on how useful that source is. So give yourself around 10 to 15 minutes to evaluate and to make up your notes, and then 45 minutes to write up your source analysis. So we're at the point now where I have completed my section on Unit 2 question 1 source skills. Next week I will be doing the question 2, which is the interpretation skills. So I hope that you'll be able to join me then as well. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will now be available to answer them live on the Q&A function until the end of the session. I think there's a minute or two left, so I'll just check to see if there are any there at the moment.